Hello again to our Evansville Pilgrim Holiness Church family and others who may be joining us here. I'd like to bring to you again a message for this week that's continuing on the sermon series that I've been talking about of different people that met Jesus on his road alongside to Jerusalem, on his path towards his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday that's upcoming, and then on towards his crucifixion and then resurrection that we're to celebrate here in just a couple of weeks. And along that pathway, we've talked about some different people and actually looked into what their perspective may have been into their meeting with Jesus. And so first of all, that started with Lazarus, a friend of Jesus, that Jesus rose from the dead, and the difference that made in Lazarus' life and Lazarus' perspective, that Jesus had given his life, or at least been willing to give his life for his. And then we went on and talked about the Samaritan leper and the way that Jesus treated him, though he was a Samaritan and though he were a leper, and the spiritual cleansing that came unto him because of his appreciation towards Jesus. And then last week, I spoke to you about the rich young ruler and kind of his perspective to Jesus and how he just couldn't understand why Jesus would ask him to give up what he believed that God had blessed him with because he was such a good person. And even without that, we found that even in the end, the rich young ruler did not come to know Jesus. And so this morning, or today, whenever you may be accessing this, I want to talk to you about another individual who was, at least at a point in his life, quite well off, quite wealthy, and had an encounter with Jesus, and his different perspective towards what Jesus had to ask of him and the difference that it made in his life. And that is a man by the name of Zacchaeus. Most of us would know the story of Zacchaeus. Pretty much all of us have grown up hearing it through Sunday school and teaching from the time that we're quite a young person. But I want to try to bring you some creative liberties and perspective on the story of Zacchaeus again here as we look into it today. The story of Zacchaeus, if you would like to read it, is in Luke chapter 19 and verses 1 through 10 is kind of the version I'll be using for a background here. And I'll jump here into the perspective of Zacchaeus and hope that you can draw something good out of his life and his meeting with Jesus on the road to Jerusalem. You know, me as Zacchaeus, I am what some of you might call a vertically challenged person. That is, I guess you could say I'm quite short. For those of you who share the same fate that I have, you know what I'm talking about. I've always lived a bit on the smaller side of life. My parents are short. In fact, most of my family heritage are all shorter people. I hoped at one point that as a young person, as I was growing, that I would inherit some long-lost height gene, but the fact is, I didn't. I would have even settled for being an average height. But you know, all my life I've been shorter and smaller than other kids even my age. When a bunch of us would get together to play games, I was almost always the last one picked to a team because no one wanted the little shrimp on their team. My legs were short, and so I couldn't jump as high or run as fast as the other kids. And most of the time, when I spoke to people that didn't know me very well, they judged me a couple of years younger than I actually was. My parents, when I would bemoan my height to them, would just kind of laugh it off and tell me that eventually I would get used to it. But I don't know that I ever have. But you know, still I can't understand how my parents, they always had such a positive outlook on things. My parents were humble people, people of little means, people that really we together as a family never had much, but still we always seemed to have just enough to get by. My father is and was a hard worker and did his best to provide for us as a family as I was growing up. And my mother, in taking care of us as the children in the household, was extremely resourceful. We would always wear our clothes until they were threadbare and full of holes and covered halfway in patches. When I was little, that didn't really bother me. I didn't really notice too much how we had less than others and neighbors. But as I got older, well, as most of you know, kids and especially teenagers can be cruel. It was bad enough that they made fun of me for being small or being short, but then they just began to pile on about me being poor and such. And it was embarrassing. And then as I got older and developed and grew a temper, it was infuriating to me. When I talked to my parents about it, they would just tell me, well, happiness is not based on one's wealth. But I wasn't so sure. Being poor, that's no picnic. And the rich people that I could look upon, the rich students that I was around, my peers, and those that I would try to get out and connect with and play with, and those that would make fun of me, and those that were the leaders in the synagogue that we went to, and the religious leaders and the government leaders, I looked upon them, and those that had such wealth just seemed to be so much happier than what I was. You might even say that they seemed to be blessed and we seemed to be cursed. In fact, that's how the religious leaders would teach it to us, is that if we would just be as God would have us to be, that He would bless us with more goods to come. When we were younger, my parents, though, in trying to keep us directed, no matter how little we had, they always did their best to give praise to God. They always took me and went for worship at the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and as often as we could and had the means to, we would make pilgrimages to Jerusalem when the opportunity presented itself. Through all of the tough times, their optimism even showed in everything that they did, and it even showed from the very beginning for me when they gave me my very name, Zacchaeus, and the meaning of it. They were so optimistic. You see, even the very meaning of my name means one that is clean and innocent and pure and righteous. My parents, I didn't really understand their optimism. I couldn't really understand their faith in Yahweh, the one true God. If He was such a good God and my parents were so faithful, then why didn't He bless them with more? Our religious system that we had was okay. I learned all about it as a boy in the synagogue when they took me in. I learned about the laws of Moses and learned all the things that a good Jewish boy was supposed to learn. I learned about the history of our people. I learned about the promised Messiah that was to come someday. In fact, as a child, maybe the one thing that I was really good at was learning. I always could learn things. I found that I was particularly good with numbers. I was good with facts and figures when others around me often weren't nearly as quick to catch on or weren't as good at it as I was. One day, as we were in school, one of the boys that was there asked me if he could borrow some money. I told him that he could borrow it if he would pay me back with interest, to which he agreed. A couple of days later, he came to pay me back, and he just kind of pulled some coins out of his pocket, and he asked me how much that he owed. And I told him that what he owed me was more than I eventually told him that I was going to charge with interest because, well, I just figured out that he didn't know any better. He didn't know what he actually owed. As I look back on things of my life now, I think that's probably the moment when it all started for me and changing who I was from a poor young boy to who I became. You see, I was tired of being picked on, and I was certainly tired of being poor. I didn't like being made fun of, and people with money, they were important. People with money ended up with power. People with money, nobody picked on them. And I wanted all of that. On one of our family pilgrimages towards Jerusalem, we stopped for a period of time in our traveling in a city named Jericho. It was the first time that I had ever been to Jericho, and Jericho was quite the city. It was here in Jericho that I saw great wealth and great poverty exist in the same city. Seemingly from one area and one street to the next, the lifestyle between the people was just radically different. The city of Jericho in our time was known as the City of Palms. Jericho was a beautiful city. Particularly in the richer parts of town, it was an extravagantly beautiful city for our time. Jericho is located about 15 miles north and east of Jerusalem and directly on the banks of the Jordan River. Herod the Great had built an amphitheater here in Jericho, as well as his winter palace, where he came in the wintertime to get away from the rougher parts of the weather and to come and just enjoy the lavish beauty of Jericho. Jericho has lush springs and wonderful palm trees that made it feel even more like the oasis that it really was. It had wonderful, beautiful gardens and lush greenery, and water from the Jordan would be pulled up even in times of drought to keep things beautiful and lush and green. And it was just a beautiful city, particularly as I looked at those who were wealthy. As a middle-aged teenager, I began to think about what life could be like if I could come and take advantage in Jericho of those that didn't know as much to put myself in a better position. You see, Jericho, because of its geographic location, had become a major hub and stop in the trading routes of our time. The highway going to the north out of Jericho led to Damascus and Tyre and Sidon, that were the great trade centers of the northern Middle Eastern area here of the way that we knew it. The western leading highways from Jericho eventually traveled to Caesarea and to Joppa, that were the big, great trading centers and ports that are on the Mediterranean Sea. There were routes that went to Egypt in the south after passing through Jerusalem, and there were those east of Jordan, over in the areas of Moab, to where a lot of other products would come through. And Jericho was a central hub around all of these points that became a great trade and exchange center. And as I looked upon all these things, as one getting up into my teenage years, I realized that this was a place where a resourceful, fact and number guy like myself could really make some money. When we returned home, I gathered what little that I had together, didn't even bother telling Mom and Dad or any of my family goodbye. I didn't really have any friends to speak of. And I turned around and I left again immediately back for Jericho. At first in Jericho, I just kind of took work wherever I could find it. Occasionally, if I couldn't find enough work, I would resort to theft to get some money. You know, here in Jericho, as I watched and began to learn the lay of the land, many rich and political leaders would come and spend time. And if you were crafty enough in being around them, there was always someone in some way to take advantage of people. I found that I could take advantage of people's lack of knowledge and whatever hobbies that, or whatever errands that they needed run or things that they needed done, that I could take advantage of it and I could overcharge for whatever it is that I was supposed to be doing. I knew that treating people this way and continuing to live this way was a risky business, and sooner or later everyone gets caught. But I was willing to take that chance because I knew I was just poor anyway, and that was no life to continue to live. So I was willing to do whatever it was going to take to become wealthy. But the problem is, one day, sure enough, I got caught cheating someone. I was sure that a beating awaited me. I knew that they would just run to the authorities and explain to them what had been done and how I had cheated them, and that immediately I would be beaten in accord with the law of what was supposed to be done. But to my utter amazement, I was absolutely shocked when instead of being offered a beating, I was offered in its place a business opportunity. I found out that the guy that I was trying to cheat was actually a master cheat himself. He knew the game even better than I did, and that was the only way that he caught me is because he was an expert at it himself. He was quite impressed with my knowledge and the way that I conducted business, the way that I went about things. And so he offered me a position working alongside him. He explained that his job was to collect taxes from people. And he explained that as he collected taxes from people, that one of the things that could be done is that he could hire people to work underneath of him and go out and collect the taxes for him. And so he asked if, given my background with numbers and my ability to work with numbers faster than most, if I would be willing to become a person that worked under him as a certified tax collector. I would just be an employee of him, but that I could work for him. In exchange for working with him, he agreed that he would not turn me into the authorities for the cheating that I'd been doing, and that he would pay me a small salary. And so that's how it started. I began to work underneath him as a tax collector and go out and knock on people's doors and collect their dues and bring them back to him. And quite soon in doing that, I began to learn, I guess you could call it, the tricks of the trade. I would collect the taxes, and then I would charge the people a little extra. And first I gave it to them and called it a collection fee. That was the part for me to keep. If people complained, I told them that by paying the collection fee, that really I was just saving them from having to pay other taxes. I was hiding them under the rug so the government didn't know about it. And instead, I would collect a little fee. And they bought it. I would pay my boss once in a while even a little bit extra of what I was supposed to collect so that hopefully he wouldn't expect anything of what I was doing, although looking back, I think he probably knew what I was up to. You see, Jericho was a tax collection center for all of the southern portion of Israel. And I soon realized that a lot of money could be made as a tax collector. So as soon as I could, instead of working for this man that had caught me as a cheat, I decided I'm going to go out on my own and I'm going to become an independent tax collector. Now, in order to do this, you had to purchase the rights to do so from the government in Rome. And so I saved up some money through my continually charging people extra, and it wasn't too long until I purchased my own tax franchise of sorts. Rome demanded a certain amount of taxation, but whatever else it was on top of that we made, they told us flat out that we were able to keep. There were certain taxes that were set by Rome, and we made sure that we collected those for them and passed them on because that's how we kept our franchise. But because most of the people were clueless about what the taxes actually were and had no choice but to take our word for it, we made up extra taxes, and I specifically did so. How were the people to know? Most of them weren't educated. You know, it was just like the first time when I took advantage of that little boy that asked me to borrow some money. He didn't know any better, and I just continued that cycle. Pretty soon, I created a tax of those coming in and out of the marketplace. I charged them by the axle on their cart as it entered the market. When that didn't generate enough money to suit me, I began to charge them not only for the axle, but for the number of wheels that they had. And then eventually went on to taxing even the animal that was pulling the cart. And finally got to the point I was taxing all of the merchandise that was coming in and out and charging them a fee on top of all of their sales of their merchandise. And since Jericho was such a center of commerce and they were still making money quite well as business people, that we were able to put on all kinds of extra taxes that we could charge to do business. And the people were none the wiser as long as they were still making enough to live on. Still yet, people began to hate me because I took so much of their money. And they could see pretty clearly that it wasn't very long until I was becoming quite rich. But you know, as I looked upon people and I looked at their disdain for me as I walked by even on the street, I just thought to myself, well, what do I even care? If they challenge me, I'll just hire someone to, quote unquote, persuade them to pay up. I didn't really give them a choice. Unfortunately, the downside to this was that it completely alienated me from others. It's not that I'd ever really had many friends. People didn't understand what it was like to be me, to be who I was. But you know what really hit me one day is it wasn't too long until they came to me. The leaders of the local synagogue in Jericho came to me and said, "You're not welcome here anymore. You're a traitor to Rome. You're a traitor to your people. You're a traitor to the Jews. You're a completely unclean individual. We want nothing to do with you. You are not welcome back in the synagogue." My first response was just like it had been towards everyone else. Well, who cares? Who needs them anyway? But yet there was still some void inside that was nagging for some social interaction with someone that appreciated me. During this time, I became the chief tax collector of Jericho, which means that everyone was to bring their taxes to me before I funneled it up through to Rome. I continued to cheat people in those ways, and I was a wealthy man. I mean, an extremely wealthy man. In my mind, I had done it. I'd arrived. I'd succeeded. I've accomplished what I've set out to do from the time that I was a little boy, to get rid of the poverty, to get rid of the stigma, to get rid of everyone that poked fun at me and looked down on me. And I didn't care who I had stepped on the way of getting to where I was. But the problem was, still yet, even as I'm here, as I've quote-unquote arrived, I'm living a lonely existence. I was never with any of my own people, let alone any friends. I wasn't welcome among any of them anymore. The so-called friends that I did have often wanted things from me, and I was confident that the only reason they were my friends or came around was because I had money and they wanted things. To be honest, I didn't even like going out into public very much because of the looks that I got from everyone. But as the chief tax collector, now I was in the place where I could have everyone else go out and collect the taxes for me, and I didn't have to go out that often. But when I did go out, I didn't get treated very well. Jericho was a large city, but even there, everyone knew who I was. And when they saw me coming, they knew that it meant that they were soon to be parting with their hard-earned money. And as much as I loved my money, I grew to hate my life because I was empty. I was lost. I was unhappy. And as much as I hated my childhood, I'll admit that there became to be parts of it that I missed and that I wanted back. It was in the midst of all these difficult things that one day a ray of hope shone in. I heard that Jesus was on his way to Jericho. I decided right then and there, as I was lost and unhappy and miserable and empty and void, that I had to see this man that everyone was talking about. Jesus had kind of been the talk of society around the local well and markets for quite some time, but especially in the last few weeks since he had raised Lazarus from the dead, people were really talking about this Jesus. There was a lot of talk about him, that perhaps he was the Messiah, that I had been promised and learned about as a young child, that he would be the one, that perhaps this Jesus was the one to lead the Jews out of their place of being oppressed and pushed down, and that he would lead them to a place of establishing a new and victorious kingdom. I thought about this Jesus. I wondered, what makes this guy tick? And can he fulfill me? Or maybe is there some way that I can take advantage of him even to see what difference he can make? But as I thought about it and wondered what he was like, as I'd heard all the stories about him, how he'd healed people and such, I thought maybe that perhaps he was someone different. I began to hear how not only he healed people, but he claimed to forgive their sins. He gave people new beginnings. And I wondered, wow, what would that be like? If I could go back to my childhood and live differently and put my mind to good use in the right ways and in the direct manners and the correct manners, what could I do with my life? I looked at my life, and my sins were numerous. If I had some way to make things right, I would. I had come to that point. If only someone would just give me another chance in life to do it differently, I would live a different way that didn't leave me estranged and empty. As I began to think about Jesus, I thought maybe that just perhaps He could be the one to give me a new start. I was always curious about Him, but what particularly piqued my interest is when I heard the story about Jesus going and speaking to other tax collectors. In fact, the word is that even one of Jesus' closest followers, whose name is Matthew, a man that I've heard of, he used to be a tax collector, and now he's one of Jesus' closest followers. These people that most everyone in society disdains and stays away from, Jesus has chosen one of them to be one of His closest followers and allows him to continually be in His midst. I had known of Matthew, and I was curious what kind of man would get you to leave the life that he had, one similar to mine of wealth and stature, and instead get rid of it all to follow a prophet or a special man, Jesus. As I began to think about Jesus, I heard that He was coming to Jericho, and as He drew near, there was absolutely no doubt when it was that Jesus was entering Jericho when He arrived. Even in the hustle and bustle of the city, everything paused and everything turned in that direction, and people began to rush and crowd to the edge of the city and come around about Him. Jesus had a large following with Him. Everyone was coming out to see the miracle man and the man that perhaps was the Messiah of the Jews. There were enormous crowds of people lining the streets and welcoming Him into Jericho, along with His followers who were coming with Him. It was good for me that the crowds were so focused on Jesus, because that meant that I could get out and about and no one was really paying attention to me to shoot me the glaring looks and the faces of disdain, which was nice for a change. The problem was that, given my stature, I couldn't see anything. There were just too many people. I was pretty sure that, knowing the city well and living there for many years and having some access, that as I kind of watched the way the crowd and the mob moved, I had a pretty good idea where Jesus may have been headed. And so I ran around the back alley and got ahead of where I thought that He might be and where He was going, ahead of where the crowds had not yet gathered, and I was sure that I could get in front of everyone. But then again, I didn't want to just stand there and let the crowd envelop me and come around, because surely they would realize who I was as they passed, and in doing so, I would face the ridicule that I would generally face. So I thought, well, maybe I can just see this Jesus and get to a place where I can hear Him and watch Him and observe what He's doing, and somewhere that people won't really notice me. And so I found this sycamore tree that was up, and the branches kind of grew out over top of the pathway, and I climbed up into it and reached out over the limb and kind of tucked myself up in there inconspicuously, where I thought no one would pay much attention to me. It wasn't too long, and sure enough, the crowds began to funnel in that direction, and they began to form in the streets, and soon a very large crowd of people came closer. I was kind of gazing through it and trying to pick out which one there might be Jesus. And then I noticed all of a sudden the man that had a bit of a clearing around him, and some men that were holding the crowd back to where he had a bit of space to work and move and choose who he might speak with. To my amazement, Jesus went over, and the first thing that I really noticed Him doing was speaking to some children. He went over and kind of patted them and rubbed them on the head and smiled and spoke to their parents. At times, someone would press into the group and break into the inner circle, and Jesus' disciples would do their best to give Jesus some room and, again, try to pull them back and allow Him to navigate His way through as He picked and chose who He would speak to. I watched Jesus in that manner work His way down the street and through the crowd as the crowd kind of moved and thronged around Him and whirled as people tried to get close enough to speak to Jesus or cry out to Him or listen to what He was saying as He walked up and down. And as they did so, they slowly worked their way as a whole mass up towards where I was. As Jesus approached where I was, I began to get excited because he was getting close enough where I should be able to hear exactly what he was saying, and I wanted to listen to the types of conversations that he had, even with the children or with their parents or anyone that would cry out to him. I was curious to hear what he was going to say to all of those that were gathered around. But it was to my utter amazement that just as he got into the distance of where I should be able to hear him, that he stopped dead in his tracks. He looked directly up into the sycamore tree where I'm just peeking out kind of between the limbs and leaves that's there. And the first thing that he did was look up at me and speak to me. As he looked up, for a moment, I wished that tree would just swallow me up and hide me completely and carry me away. But it was impossible, because Jesus turned all of the attention of that entire thronging mob directly up into that tree to me. And I'll never forget what it is that Jesus said to me immediately. He said, "Zacchaeus, come down right now. Tonight, I must stay at your house." The first thing that just blew me away is that Jesus knew my name. How did Jesus know my name? How is it that this holy man, this miracle-working man, is talking to me, a tax collector, a completely unclean Jew, one who's been completely disregarded and disdained and thrown out of his very religion that he's supposed to be a special man of? And not only did he know me, but he knew me by name. Not only was he talking to me, and not only did he speak to me, but he said he wanted to come to my house. Did Jesus not realize that if he associates with me, that people might assume that the sins of my household would be transferred to him, and just as I'm unclean, that he would be viewed as unclean? You see, that's what I'd always been taught, is that if you came around and interacted with, and particularly if you touched an unclean person, that you became unclean as they were. Oh yeah, people knew. They knew it all. You should have heard the grumbling in the crowd. People knew well who I was. They knew what I was all about, and they knew there was something about Jesus. It was just different if he was going to associate with me. I heard everything of grumbling of why would Jesus spend his time with this unclean man to, or why would Jesus go and spend time with a rich man? Oh, Jesus must just want part of Zacchaeus' money. He thinks that he can befriend him because he's high and mighty and wealthy. But you know, very quickly I realized that it was none of those things. As Jesus spoke to me, the words that he spoke, those so simple. Zacchaeus, come down here immediately. I must go into your house. Even as he said those things, there was a kindness in his voice. There was an acceptance in his face. There was unlike any acceptance that I'd ever seen outside of my own parents that cared for me, that loved me. Jesus was very clearly and knowingly willing to give up his good status just for me. He cared about me. Here was my chance. This man was giving me a second chance. I'd heard about his forgiveness of sin of others, but I had never thought that he could love me, one who's been completely cast out. It was a chance to make things right, and it was right then and there, even before I scrambled down out of the tree, that I cried out to Jesus, and I said, Lord, here and now, I will give half of all that I own, of all my possessions to the poor. And Lord, if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay them back 4 times the amount that I've cheated them. I don't know exactly what brought me to say that, other than I knew at that moment that I was willing to do anything to gain a second chance on life. I don't know that it was even possible for me financially to pay back 4 times to every man what I had taken. But the intent of my heart was that if I'd wronged anyone, to pay it back so fully and so supremely that there was no doubt that I could be accepted again, even if it made me live in rags as a poor man, wondering where my next meal would come from, as I had as a child. You see, I had had a change of heart, but even that wasn't enough. I felt like I needed my actions to back it up. Jesus then looked at me and he said loud enough for everyone anywhere near in the crowd to hear, "Today, salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which is lost." You see, Jesus didn't just come to save the spiritually elite. Jesus didn't just come to save the complete, poor, well-meaning person. Jesus came to save those who knew better and yet did not do better. You see, Jesus saw me for what I was. He knew that I was a lost soul. I was a Jew, but I had lost my way. I had chased fortune and not used it for good. And while I was lost, Jesus found me. He came seeking me because he knew that I, Zacchaeus, was lost. He knew my name. He knew my past. And he sought me. And I'm here to tell you today that he saved my life. I'm a completely new and different person. From that moment when Jesus spoke the words, "Today salvation has come to this house," a feeling of peace roared over me. Satisfaction flooded into my soul. I was a changed man. I changed my life, but most importantly, I changed my feeling of being lost and empty and hurt and in despair. You see, an encounter with Jesus has a way of doing that. If Jesus can save an awful person like me, then he can surely do the same for all of you, whoever you may be. I was one of the worst. And not only was Jesus willing to save me, he came and sought me out that he might save me. And I'm here today to share my testimony with you for one singular purpose, and that's to let you know that if you're lost, if you're hurting, if you're empty, if you're in despair, if you're in disdain, if you're cast out, if you're living an unclean life of sin, Jesus knows who you are, and he comes to seek you as you are. No matter what you've done, no matter who you are, Jesus is coming and he's seeking you. He doesn't want to leave you as you are. He will forgive you of your sins. But I'm telling you, even as he looked upon me in judgment, knowing who I was, he didn't judge me like everyone else judged me. He judged me in a way saying, "I want to change you and I want to make you better. I want to give you a new chance and I want to give you a new life." And so if you're one in despair, I want to tell you today, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to allow him to come. Don't be afraid to respond to his call. Don't be afraid to make a change. Don't think it's too late to make a change. Jesus is the only one who can fill the void in your life and give you purpose. And he is seeking you. So I ask you today, will you welcome him into your life? And as you do so, will you allow your life to show it? And instead of seeking after the things you always have that have just brought about more emptiness, will you follow him? I'm telling you, my life was forever changed that day that I met Jesus as I was dangling out in a limb over top of the road, and as he looked up at me. Jesus saved me on the road to Jerusalem. That is my story as Zacchaeus. Now I want to draw your attention here for a moment to the difference in the attitude of the heart between the rich young ruler and Zacchaeus. One of them couldn't see Jesus as who he was. The other one believed him seemingly of who he was the moment that they first heard from him and set their eyes upon him, because they had an encounter with Jesus with a heart that was already cultivated and ready for change. Jesus sought them both out. Jesus is seeking you out. The difference in the outcome was due to the difference in their response. So my question to you today is this: what is and what has been and what will continue to be your response to Jesus? Have you allowed him to change your life? If not, he's seeking you. And I would encourage you even now to just say, Jesus, I do believe that you're the Son of God. I believe that you have the power to work miracles, that the greatest of miracles is to take a sinful life and make it as one who's righteous. That's possible through the sacrifice that you made on my behalf, and can be done because of your victorious reigning and life over death, hell, and the grave and sin. Lord, I ask that you'd forgive me. I ask that you'd change my life. I ask that you'd fill the void in my life. And as you do that, I can absolutely assure you on the authority of the Bible as the Holy Word of God, he will be faithful and just, forgive you of your sins, and set you on a straight and narrow way that leads to heaven. And myself, and we as the Evansville Pilgrim Holiness Church, want to be here to help to assist you and walk beside you on that path. If there's anything we can do to help, reach out to us. We'll be glad to try to lead you on your spiritual walk. Be like Zacchaeus. Respond to Jesus with a heart of openness, not like the rich young ruler. God bless you. I'll talk to you soon.